Have you ever wondered why some people give off an inexplicable feeling of discomfort? It's as if there is something sinister lurking behind the mask of benevolence. Carl Jung, a prominent psychologist, devoted years to studying the human psyche and discovered a disturbing pattern. There is a subtle signal that portends danger that far exceeds the usual physical threats. This signal, which often eludes conscious perception, is picked up by our deepest instincts and manifests itself not in aggressive outbursts or obvious hostility, but in subtle nuances that make it particularly insidious. Ancient civilizations warned of such personalities, but Jung was able to scientifically substantiate what our ancestors felt intuitively. Frighteningly, the signal can come from people who seem quite ordinary and even charming. And when it manifests itself, the only sensible action is to immediately distance oneself. Shadow projection is one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms Jung identified in human relationships. Imagine a situation. During a conversation with someone, you are suddenly attributed intentions, thoughts, or negative traits that are absolutely not peculiar to you. This person is not reacting to your real personality, but to a distorted image created in their own imagination. But what exactly makes people project their shadow onto others? And how to recognize this dangerous mechanism to protect yourself from its destructive consequences? The answers to these questions can change your perception of human relationships and teach you to see the hidden dangers that lurk behind the facade of everyday life. Doesn't this remind you of something? What you are feeling right now is nothing less than a projection of the Jungian shadow in its most unclouded form. The shadow, according to Jung's definition, is the totality of all that a person does not accept in himself, character traits and qualities that he considers reprehensible and banishes to the unconscious. But these rejected elements do not disappear, they only hide from conscious perception, accumulating powerful energy in the depths of the human psyche. When an individual systematically projects his shadow onto others, it is the most disturbing sign Jung identified, a complete lack of ability to recognize his own, repressed aspects of personality. Such a person is literally unable to discern these traits in himself, so he sees them exclusively in other people. The danger of the situation lies in the fact that, from his subjective point of view, you really are the embodiment of all these negative qualities. It is worth noting that ancient spiritual teachings understood this phenomenon long before Carl Jung gave it a scientific explanation. In Buddhist philosophy, there is the concept of a darkened mirror that reflects one's own vices and shortcomings, presenting them as someone else's. In the Christian tradition, we find the vivid metaphor of the log in one's own eye, while one only notices the speck in another's eye. Particularly disturbing is the fact that an individual engaged in projecting his or her own shadow side unwaveringly believes in the truth of his or her perceptions. The problem is not a deliberate lie, but a sincere belief that the other person reflects the very traits he or she denies in themselves. This perceptual distortion creates a kind of certainty that has a powerful effect on others. A person projecting a shadow is able to convince others that you possess exactly the qualities he attributes to you. Modern neurobiological research confirms the concept proposed by Jung. The human brain actively filters reality to confirm already existing beliefs. However, in situations of intense shadow projection, this filter becomes a mechanism for completely distorting reality. Researcher Robert Johnson compares this phenomenon to wearing glasses, which radically change the perception of the entire surrounding world. But how can you recognize the situation when you encounter a person who is actively projecting his shadow? The first sign is a sense of discrepancy between what this person says about you and your own inner experience. It is not uncommon to falsely accuse someone of motives that are foreign to them or to attribute feelings to them that they have never experienced. The accusers demonstrate an unshakable confidence in their rightness, ignoring any arguments that contradict their beliefs. What is the nature of this phenomenon? In reality, it is a manifestation of internal conflict playing outwardly. A person who acts in this way is engaged in a fierce struggle with unacceptable aspects of his or her own personality, and those around him or her unwittingly become witnesses and participants in this battle. A well-known proverb says that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher, would complement this saying by noting that this road is also driven by those who unquestioningly believe themselves to be paragons of virtue. Ego inflation is a serious threat precisely because it is skillfully disguised as nobility. When we observe an individual unshakably convinced of his moral superiority, spiritual infallibility, or possession of absolute truth, we encounter what Jung called psychic inflation. This phenomenon is perhaps one of the most disturbing signs. Unlike ordinary arrogance, which is easy enough to recognize, Jungian inflation is a much deeper and more dangerous phenomenon. It occurs when a person's ego becomes identified with archetypal images, especially the archetype of the savior, the enlightened, or the bearer of truth. When an individual ceases to see himself as a mortal human being and begins to envision himself as the direct embodiment of a divine origin or absolute truth, this becomes a dangerous delusion. Even in the Middle Ages, the German mystic Meister Eckhart warned against such arrogance, calling it the most insidious trap on the path of spiritual development. In Zen Buddhism, this condition is known as the Zen disease, and Sufis speak of the veil of light, which is more dangerous than the veil of darkness because it is much more difficult to recognize as an obstacle. A sure sign that a person is subject to this illusion is his unshakable confidence in his own motives. While the greatest sages of all time have shown the deepest humility in the face of the inscrutable mysteries of existence, those who suffer from psychic inflation display an absolute conviction that they are right. They do not even allow for the possibility of error because they are convinced that they are not expressing personal views but universal truths that are accessible only to a select few. A particular danger is that this state can produce extraordinary charisma. As Jung noted, leaders subject to psychic inflation often attract devoted followers precisely because of their unshakable confidence. This certainty satisfies a deep-seated human need for security and definitive answers in a world full of uncertainty and doubt. In his research on spiritual traditions, Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo pointed out that the spiritual ego represents the most sophisticated and elusive form of egoism. Whereas the ordinary ego claims to be important, the inflated spiritual ego claims to be a conduit for higher powers and the common good. This subtle difference explains why many people are subconsciously drawn to personalities who, despite potential danger, appear to be spiritually enlightened. So how do we recognize the signs of psychic inflation in a person? One of the key indicators is his reaction to criticism or expressions of disagreement. A person subject to archetypal ego inflation perceives any questions or doubts not as valuable information, but as an attack against the cosmic order. Any expression of opposition is seen not as natural human descent, but as resistance to the good, the truth, or the divine origin they believe they represent. Carl Jung warned that such a condition posed a serious threat not only to those around them, but also to the inflationary individual himself. The identification of the limited ego with transpersonal content puts the psyche under tremendous strain that requires compensation. The more the ego is inflated, the more crushing the collapse will be when the suppressed aspects of the personality inevitably come to the surface. Carl Jung drew attention to a disturbing phenomenon: people who consistently exhibit exactly the behavior that is expected of them. Such perfect social adaptation erases any manifestations of individuality, irregularities of character, and signs of human spontaneity. This perfect mask, or persona, as Jung called it, using a term from ancient Greek theater, serves as a warning that the instincts pick up on long before the mind can comprehend. Complete identification with this mask is a grave psychological danger, indicating a profound disconnect between the outer appearance and the inner self. The individual sacrifices his authenticity for social approval, creating a facade so elaborate that he eventually forgets his true self hidden behind the mask. As the poet Fernando Pessoa accurately pointed out, the danger is not in wearing the mask, but in losing the realization that it is only a mask. Eastern contemplative practices have been pointing to this phenomenon for millennia. In Zen Buddhism, there is the concept of the original face before birth, referring to that essential authenticity that exists beyond social roles and constructs. The sages of Taoist philosophy warned against becoming overly preoccupied with the outside of things, pointing to the risk of losing one's true essence. Carl Jung drew on these ancient insights and expressed similar ideas in terms of modern psychology. One disturbing sign is the feeling of artificiality in dealing with certain people. Even if their demeanor is impeccable and they always know what to say and how to behave, their actions lack the spontaneity and inconsistency that is characteristic of true human nature. Jungian analyst James Hollis emphasized that excessive striving for perfection in social adaptation often indicates a deep emptiness in a person's inner world. Modern research in the field of neurobiology sheds light on this phenomenon. There are so-called mirror neurons in our brains that can pick up the slightest discrepancies between the words, facial expressions, and body language of others. When a person's external manifestation is completely disconnected from his or her internal state, these neurons generate an alarm signal, which we experience as an unexplained feeling of discomfort or distrust. The true threat lurks in the depths of this extreme disconnection. When an individual devotes all his mental resources to maintaining an impeccable outward appearance, the rejected facets of his essence do not disappear without a trace. They accumulate in the depths of the unconscious, forming what Carl Jung dubbed the shadow. And the stricter the framework of the imposed social role, the more uncontrollable and destructive this shadow becomes when it inevitably breaks out. Maria Luisa von Franz, an associate of Jung, observed that people who demonstrate exemplary social adaptability often experience shadow outbursts, moments when all the restrained energy erupts unpredictably and destructively. This mechanism explains why sometimes the most seemingly flawless individuals are capable of actions that are shockingly destructive. Full identification with the social mask, according to Jung, is a betrayal of the self, a rejection of the true self in favor of an artificial image, and like any deep betrayal, it inevitably leaves its mark on the psyche. Imagine the situation. In an ordinary conversation, you suddenly catch a subtle but profound change in your interlocutor. Outwardly, it is still the same person, but something has radically changed in his gaze, in his energy, in the very manner of his presence. It's as if something ancient and transpersonal is shining through him. This disturbing phenomenon, which in traditional cultures was often seen as a form of obsession, was conceptualized by Carl Jung as archetypal obsession, perhaps the most alarming sign one can notice in another person. Archetypes, according to Jung, are primordial patterns rooted in the collective unconscious of humanity. They are the structuring forces that shape our experience and contain both light and shadow sides. When an archetype takes over an individual's consciousness, it loses its uniqueness and becomes a conduit for transpersonal energies far beyond its ability to integrate. The shamanic traditions of various cultures have been keenly aware of this phenomenon. The famous anthropologist Mircea Eliade, in his works, described how shamans distinguish between controlled states of channeling and dangerous states of obsession, when individual identity is completely dissolved, absorbed by an external force. In the Christian mystical tradition, the ability to discern spirits has always been considered a key skill for separating beneficial psychic influences from those that carry the threat of destruction. One alarming signal is a person's loss of psychological flexibility and his excessive, unwavering adherence to one archetype. This may manifest itself in the image of an unconditional savior, inexorable warrior, eternal victim, or infallible judge. In this case, the specific archetype is not as important as absolute identification with it. Among the obvious signs are an unusual gleam in the eyes, monotony of speech, and a strange sense that the person seems to be absent in the usual sense. Jungian analyst Robert Moore emphasized that in such cases we are not dealing with a coherent personality, but with an archetypal fragment that has taken hold of consciousness. Modern research in the field of neuropsychology confirms the existence of altered states of consciousness, in which there is a decrease in activity in certain areas of the brain responsible for the formation of personal identity. In the moments when the realms of transpersonal experience are set in motion, such states of consciousness, despite their value within controlled ritual practices, can carry serious dangers if they occur involuntarily outside of a specially prepared environment. Of particular concern is the fact that an individual who has been influenced by an archetype feels unusually self-confident and purposeful. The uncertainty inherent in the normal state of consciousness gives way to absolute conviction, which can have a powerful effect on others. As Jung noted, political and religious leaders under the influence of archetypal obsession are able to initiate mass movements precisely because of this supernatural certainty. The main danger is that archetypes, being the original models of the collective unconscious, contain extreme opposites. For example, the savior archetype contains both the potential for redemptive compassion and destructive fanaticism. When a person fully identifies with an archetype, he or she inevitably manifests its darkest aspects, often without realizing the inner contradiction. Carl Jung scrupulously recorded many situations when individuals who fell under the power of archetypes committed acts contrary to their conscious principles and later experienced amnesia or resorted to convincing rationalization. Archetype obsession represents a transient loss of the capacity for introspection, the very trait that makes us human. There is a phenomenon in psychology that is so frightening that when you notice its manifestation in someone, you realize that you are witnessing a real tragedy of personality formation. Jung called it compulsive reproduction of unconscious scripts, when a person recreates the same traumatic circumstances over and over again, as if trapped in an invisible labyrinth from which he cannot escape. This disturbing sign, clearly discernible in the other person, signals that we are facing an exceptional danger, being drawn into a psychological drama that is foreign to us. Genuine anxiety is caused by the automaticity and unconsciousness inherent in compulsive repetition. People do not consciously and deliberately seek to reproduce destructive behaviors. Rather, they become hostage to powerful psychic forces operating beyond their awareness. In the words of psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas, we are talking about ill-conceived knowledge that shapes experiences so profound or traumatic that they have never been cognitively processed, yet structure all subsequent life experience. It is noteworthy that spiritual traditions have recognized this phenomenon for thousands of years. The Buddhist concept of karma originally referred not to some cosmic system of retribution, but specifically to these persistent patterns of conditioning that steadily push us to recreate similar circumstances. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of original sin can be interpreted in psychological terms as unconscious patterns that we inherit and, without realizing it, continue to reproduce. A clear signal is the observation of a person who finds himself in the same painful situations time after time, with different actors, but in a remarkably similar scenario. What is even more striking is that this person seems genuinely surprised by the repetition each time, as if he were an innocent victim of fate rather than the unconscious creator of his own recurring drama. The neurobiology of our days reveals the biological roots of this phenomenon. Experiences at a young age, especially traumatic ones, form neural connections that later become the easiest pathways for perceiving information. The brain develops a kind of neurological preset, an unconscious desire to confirm previously formed perceptions of the world, even if these perceptions are the source of suffering. The greatest danger is that people trapped in unconscious repetition unwittingly involve those around them in playing out their inner drama. Psychoanalyst Donald Kalchid has accurately observed that unprocessed trauma requires theatricality. Without realizing it, we may find ourselves caught up in a story that began long before we knew the person. Carl Jung noticed an interesting pattern. The deeper the obsessive repetition goes into the unconscious, the more often it manifests itself in external life in the form of synchronicities, that is, significant coincidences. A person, without realizing it, creates situations that reproduce his inner conflicts, but perceives what happens as a result of ruthless and unjust fate. Among Jungian psychotherapists, there is a practice of recognizing a particular signal that appears in the narratives of patients. This signal sounds when a person repeatedly tells stories in which he or she is invariably betrayed, abandoned, misunderstood, or presented as a victim in situations that are strikingly similar. As Maria Luisa von Franz accurately pointed out, until a person realizes the contents of his unconscious, it will invisibly control his existence, and the person himself will be inclined to explain what happens to him by the influence of fate. Of greatest concern is the almost magical power of compulsive repetition. An individual trapped in such behavioral patterns without realizing it sends outward signals that attract to him exactly those people who are able to help him in the reproduction of his original traumatic scenarios. Carl Jung gave this phenomenon the name negative synchronicity, emphasizing the unconscious's extraordinary ability to organize encounters and circumstances in such a way as to perpetuate unresolved inner conflicts and patterns. However, if the signals described above indicate the deepest dangers, then, according to Jung's teachings, there is also a path to transformation to overcome these threats. This path consists in the conscious integration of the shadow, those aspects of the personality that are normally rejected and repressed. This process represents a fundamental distinction between people who pose a psychological danger to themselves and others, and those who have embarked on the path of achieving psychic wholeness and harmony. It is amazing how unmistakably we determine the presence or absence of inner harmony in a person. Noticing its manifestation, we seem to encounter the opposite of psychological vulnerability. However, the integration of the shadow sides of the personality is not synonymous with flawlessness or the absence of negative traits. Rather, it is a conscious and humble recognition of our susceptibility to the same weaknesses and vices we see in those around us. As Jung aptly observed, "I would rather be whole than good." This phrase is often misinterpreted, but it points to the fundamental difference between true psychological wholeness and the hypocritical mask of perfection that conceals dangerous inner conflicts. Over the millennia, different contemplative practices have described this process using different terms. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, of recognizing and constructively using even the most complex emotions and inclinations. Western alchemy, which Jung admired, symbolically depicted this process as the transformation of lead, rejected aspects, into gold, integrated consciousness. There is no mistaking the definition of a person on the path of deep inner integration. He is distinguished by a unique combination of unwavering honesty about his own dark sides and genuine empathy for others. He is able to recognize his destructive impulses and tendencies without excessive self-abuse or condoning them, seeing them as an integral part of human nature that requires constant attention. Modern neurobiological research confirms that this process is accompanied by very specific changes in brain function. Scientists such as Daniel Siegel have convincingly demonstrated that the integration of previously disconnected fragments of experience literally forms new neural connections between different parts of the brain, especially between the ancient emotional centers and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for introspection. The true transformation in this process is that the conscious acceptance of one's most difficult sides paradoxically greatly reduces the likelihood of their uncontrollable subconscious manifestation. As Jungian analysts have noted, this phenomenon is the key to personal growth and healing. Robert Johnson once astutely observed that the denied aspects of our personality do not disappear without a trace, but rather manifest in forms over which we lose control. Conscious integration of these dark sides, by contrast, can transform potentially destructive psychic energy into a powerful source of creative inspiration. A person who sincerely devotes himself to this inner work gains the unique ability to see the world in all its many facets, avoiding a simplistic black-and-white perception. He or she refuses to be rigidly divided into good and evil, recognizing the inherent complexity and contradictory nature of every human being. As the Jungian psychologist James Hollis subtly pointed out, true psychological maturity comes when we let go of the illusion of our own infallibility and begin to accept ourselves as a whole with all our strengths and weaknesses. Authentic spiritual leaders throughout history have exemplified this integration. The Dalai Lama speaks openly about his moments of anger, Teresa of Avila admitted to periods of spiritual drought, and the Sufi mystic Rumi poetically described his inner contradictions. This radical honesty stands in stark contrast to the contrived perfection of those who are alienated from their shadows, those aspects of themselves that they prefer to hide from themselves and others. The unique blend of true humility, far from ostentatious modesty and genuine authority, alien to authoritarianism, is a sure sign of integration. A person who has achieved integration does not need to boast of his virtue or wisdom, for he has outgrown the need for perfect self-image. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki aptly put it, the beginner's mind is full of possibilities, whereas the expert has very few. Before we conclude, it is worth considering whether you have ever noticed similar manifestations in significant people in your life. And more importantly, have you recognized echoes of these patterns in yourself? If this message resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Awareness is the first step towards transformation. Be sure to share this information with others who need an awakening to the unconscious patterns that define their relationships with others. Activate notifications and subscribe to the channel to immerse yourself in the fascinating world of Jungian psychology and learn more about the underlying processes that shape our personality and destiny.